Hi friends, today we're going to read the rest of The Graves Family Goes Camping. And if you remember when we left yesterday, we got to this part where they all fell and disappeared into this hole somewhere in the jungle or in the forest. So let's keep reading. Suddenly, a familiar face appeared above them. "Phoebe," Ronnie called out as she dropped a long rope to them. Phoebe had saved the day, but when they'd all been pulled to safety, Dr. Graves bent to study the edges of the hole. "That was no ordinary hole," he said. "That was an enormous footprint." The children wheeled around and looked. "But what could make a footprint like that?" Sarah whispered. Dr. Graves had no answer. But when they all got back to camp, Dr. Graves scoured his books on species, life forms, and legends. "By Jove, that's it!" Dr. Graves shouted with excitement. He was pointing at a fearsome picture of a hideous monster. "That is the footprint of the flatulent, sulfuric, verminous flying griffin, a real fire breather, the kind that legends are made of." "You mean a fire-breathing dragon?" Sarah said fearfully. "But they don't exist, do they?" asked Seth fearfully. "Of course not," said Dr. Graves. "At least, they are most certainly extinct now." So extinct means they no longer exist. Before anyone could ask Dr. Graves anything more, though, Mrs. Graves called out, "Jum Jills, everyone!" and set out the most delightful little cake-like, muffin-esque, cream-puffy, dream-puffy, bite-sized morsels. "Now, children, only one at a time. It won't do to eat these too fast," Mrs. Graves said sternly. Seth was first. He took one small bite, then uncontrollably stuffed the entire Jum Jill into his mouth. "These are heavenly," Sarah gushed, as she bolted one down with gusto. "The best you've ever made, lovey," Dr. Graves added, smacking his lips. "You have to give my mom the recipe," Sarah said between mouthfuls. "That isn't possible, my dear. You see, this recipe is a closely guarded family secret. Jum Jills have a very unusual effect on those who eat them. One bite and they will go into a veritable eating frenzy. Well, to bed all. Tomorrow morning we must away into the deepest, densest part of the forest again to study the footprint. This may be the scientific find of the century," Dr. Graves said as he snatched one of the two Jum Jills left off of the plate. The next morning, the whole household awoke to the high-pitched screams of Mrs. Graves out by the campfire. Everyone raced outdoors, and they were stunned by what they saw. "Footprints," Ronnie said with alarm. "Exactly like the one we fell into." "That means that wasn't an ancient footprint," Seth said with even greater alarm. "These footprints are fresh, just made." "A fire-breathing dragon here? Now?" Sarah whispered. Even Phoebe scampered into the little pink trailer and peered out, looking very concerned. "Oh dear," Mrs. Graves gasped. "I understand. Someone left one single Jum Jill behind, and it looks like whatever this creature is ate it. But you all know what that means. It will be back for more," everyone said in unison. At exactly that moment, the dark shadow hovered above them. Then something swooped down out of the sky and landed with a watery crash that felled the trees and swamped the shoreline. A horrifying screech came from it. A puff of acrid smoke and plume of fire and brimstone arched from its mouth and burned a small thicket of trees to the ground. Mrs. Graves pulled the children into the trailer. "Wait!" Dr. Graves shouted as he picked up a piece of his scientific equipment. "My translanguator." "Let's see," he said as he fiddled with the levers and buttons. "I'll set the base tongue at lizard and Komodo dragon and hope that this is close to its own language." Then Dr. Graves set the machine on project, lifted the announcing cone to his lips, and called out a cheery, friendly greeting. The translanguator whirred and popped, and a sound rippled over the surface of the water and made the trees flutter. The creature cocked its head, narrowed its eyes, and leaned close to the translanguator, sniffing and snorting a puff of smoke. "What does it want?" Mrs. Graves called out from the trailer. Dr. Graves asked that very question into the projecting cone, then flipped a couple of switches. A strange sound came out of the machine that seemed to startle the creature. It came closer and bellowed back into the machine. Dr. Graves flipped a couple of switches, and a booming voice screamed, "Food!" long before the Graves family realized that the creature was interested in only one kind of food: Jum-Jills. In the next days, while Mrs. Graves, Phoebe, and the children shoveled Jum-Jills into the dragon as quickly as they could make them, Dr. Graves learned that the creature was the last of its kind, that it was a female, and that it was lonely. They also soon discovered that its appetite for Jum-Jills was impossible to fill, and that they were going to run out of supplies. Then what, they wondered. "We have to get back to Union City," Mrs. Graves cried after a full day of feeding frenzy. "Bill and Nancy must be sick with worry, and the 4th of July Spectacular is only 2 days away. I have a plan, lovey. After the dragon's evening meal of Jum-Jills, we'll break camp, drive up the escarpment tunnel, and leave," Dr. Graves said, whispered to his wife. That evening, after the dragon flew off, the Graves family did exactly that. But then they got to the escarpment tunnel, and the dragon was there, waiting for them. It shrieked and spewed flames at the car and stomped its feet so hard that it collapsed the tunnel, sealing them all in the valley. Now, there was no escape. But Mrs. Graves was angry. The next morning, Mrs. Graves was waiting for the creature. When it landed, she scolded into the translinguator. "It would seem to me that you need to learn some manners. You make friends by being a friend, not holding people captive against their wills. You will frighten the children. Furthermore, any polite guest knows, when offered a basket of Jum-Jills, a guest only takes one. And now you've trapped us here." Mrs. Graves broke down and cried. The dragon fluttered its eyes. Looking sheepish, it sniffed the basket of Jum-Jills. Then it flew off, this time disappearing into the horizon. All night, Dr. Graves was frantic. They had run out of food and supplies. He hadn't allowed cell phones on vacation, and they wouldn't have worked here anyway. They were trapped, and he was worried what would happen when the dragon realized there were no more Jum-Jills. It was at that moment when Dr. Graves noticed that Queemich Island seemed to be floating right toward the shore where he was sitting. With a giant whoosh, it beached itself. It was only then that Dr. Graves noticed that it wasn't an island at all. It appeared to be a very large boat. He set the entire family to pulling vines and brush off the boat. And that's when he saw it silhouetted in the moonlight. It was the Queen of Michigan. Now he remembered a legend he had forgotten, that once there was a canal that connected this lake, so streams and rivers, and finally to the Great Lakes themselves. The Queen of Michigan had navigated that canal until the night of the big summer storm, nearly 100 years before. That night, the riverboat had disappeared and had never been seen again, nor had the canal. "Lovey, it's our way out," Dr. Graves exclaimed to Mrs. Graves. "Pack up the camp, drive the car and trailer onto the deck, and I'll look for a way to get the Queen's engines to run again." Dr. Graves filled the water tanks and got the children to help him gather wood to stoke up the fires and get the boilers steaming. Then he dropped a small tablet into each water tank. "My own invention. It may give us a little boost when we need it," he said proudly. When everyone was aboard, Seth stoked the fires, Sarah pulled the steam valves, and Mrs. Graves steered, while Dr. Graves freed the steering wheel. Then he and Ronnie read the ancient map. According to this map, the entrance to the old canal is right about there. He pointed at a mound of suspiciously tangled roots along the shore, not far from where they had camped. "Full speed ahead," he shouted, pointing at the spot. With that, they got up a full head of steam, and Mrs. Graves ran straight into what looked like the banks of Lake Bleakmire. They spent the whole night navigating the canal, streams, rivers, and finally a lake. Dr. Graves announced it was Union Lake, and their beloved Union City was dead ahead. The riverboat bumped into the shore at Shirt Tail Flutter, just across the St. Joe River from the football field where the fireworks show was going to happen in 2 short days. Ronnie looked up. "It looks like rain." "Don't even think about it, son," Dr. Graves said. "But what if it did rain? The fireworks would get wet, and that would be a disaster, wouldn't it?" "Yes, but it's not going to happen. Trust me," yawned Dr. Graves. Exhausted from the night of travel, they drove the car and trailer home and collapsed in their beds. On the 4th of July, Dr. and Mrs. Graves awoke to a commotion in their living room. "Mom, Dad," Ronnie was shouting, "it's the dragon. She followed us here. She's on the river next to the riverboat, right across from the football field." "Jum Jills," both Dr. and Mrs. Graves said. "Doug, if that creature burns down the town with her breath, we most certainly will no longer be welcome in Union City," Mrs. Graves sobbed. But Dr. Graves was tapping his head. "Lovey, you best get busy making Jum Jills. It will buy us time until I think of what to do." When they got to the river, the dragon had already pitched a temper tantrum, burned down a small clump of trees, and thrashed about in the river so much that she had swamped the football field with water and soaked the fireworks. "Naughty, naughty," Dr. Graves scolded the dragon. It cowered low to the riverbank and looked sheepish. "I'll bring you some Jum Jills later tonight. You'll have to sit and wait." Dr. Graves spent most of the day racking his brain for a solution to the dragon problem, not to mention how he was going to tell the whole town that the fireworks weren't happening. "Here's the basket of Jum Jills, dear," Mrs. Graves said when she had made her first batch. Luckily, Phoebe had helped. "Don't worry, people will understand about the fireworks." Dr. Graves stared at the basket of Jum Jills for a moment, then he smiled wryly and took them to his laboratory in the basement. In a few moments, he came back upstairs humming and made his way to the riverbank, where he left the basket of Jum Jills. That evening, the Union City football field was filled to capacity. As Dr. Graves climbed the steps to the platform, cameras crackled and people cheered, but as he stepped up to the microphone, he had a heavy heart. Clearly, his plan hadn't worked. But just as he opened his mouth to announce that there would be no fireworks this year, something started to happen down on the riverbank across from the football field. The ground rumbled and shook. Then there was an explosion of such monumental proportion that windows rattled in their panes as far away as Mackinac Island. Then dazzling colors shot into the night sky. The crowd oohed and awed. Then there was a gargantuan, catastrophic burp that was so loud it shattered vases clear over in cold water. More light and color catapulted up, up, up into the stratosphere. Lights were seen as far away as Mississippi. Then a large balloon thing darted around the sky, this way and that, with plumes of flame and fireworks shooting out of it. Ronnie, Sarah, and Seth looked very carefully at the balloon. It was the dragon. It was wheezing and coughing flames and fireworks. It shot straight up with a belch, swooping down with a cough, and spiraled sideways with its stomach grumbling, fiery puffs of rockets of color. Oh my, it was spectacular. Well, sir, that 4th of July was legendary, all right. That single night put Union City right up there with New York and Chicago in the annals of pyrotechnic displays. And there was no need at all for anyone to know that Dr. Graves had sprinkled his new and experimental firepower into those Jum Jills that night. Of course, not a citizen, with the exception of the Graves and Miller families, would ever learn of the dragon's existence. From that time on, she was content to stay quietly hidden in the marshes at Shirt Tail Flutter, next to the football field on the river. On some nights, she was happy to take the Graves family, including Phoebe, of course, out for a midnight flight on her leathery back. They had become quite good friends. They named her Barbara. Of course, Mrs. Graves visited Barbara every morning and brought her a basket of Jum Jills, but she had learned her lesson. From that time on, she took only one Jum Jill, at least only one at a time. The end. Alright, so that was a really fun story, and I have some questions up on the website for you all to answer, and thank you for listening.